Welcome back to Major Intonio's presentation of 13 Days, The Chronicle of an Escape from a German Prison, by John Caunter. Chapter 3, Schwarmstedt Camp.
Our first sight of this camp hardly encouraged us to think that we were going to a better place than Krefeld. An ominous silence fell upon the incoming prisoners, and it was a particularly sulky lot who faced the new commandant when he had them formed up in front of him. He admitted the bad state of the camp in his very first speech and hoped that we would put up with it as he himself was powerless to alter matters. On being dismissed, we went off to our rooms and very soon found out all about our new prison. Imagine dirty sand covering a layer of peat with water 2 feet underneath it, enclosed with a barbed wire fence. In this area, put 4 long, low wooden huts with tarred felt roofs, 3 much smaller ones, 3 pumps, a long latrine, a hospital hut, and some cells, and you have the sum total of the buildings in the camp. The 3 long, low huts held 390 officers, each hut divided roughly into 8 to 10 rooms. Many of the rooms held 16 officers, and so crowded were the beds in them that 3 pairs had to touch in many instances, despite repeated and varied ways of rearrangement being tried. The latrines were very close and handy, so much so, in fact, that their ends came to within 10 paces of the living rooms at the end of 2 of the huts. As the latrines were never cleared out, the atmosphere in these near huts was something too appalling for words, especially if a west wind was blowing. The drinking water had been passed as fit for human beings by the German sanitary authorities. For all that, the majority of us only drank tea and coffee, etc., requiring boiling water. The water was brownish and smelt abominably. We became expert laundry hands, as we had to wash our own clothes, and so learnt the art from experience. Many of the prisoners were able to see the comic side of life in this place, fortunately, and so made the best of a bad job. As the bathhouse was outside of the wire fence, we could only get to it by going on parole, or by being marched out in groups. This naturally meant that the turn for baths did not come round too often. If one refused to give parole for this purpose, a bath could be got twice a week with luck. The natural outcome of this was that everyone used to bath under the pumps which were situated between the living huts. It was a common sight to see between 20 and 30 naked figures throwing water over each other round the pumps. It was absolutely impossible to play tennis or football in this camp, as there was no space in which to do such things. The little ground lying between the living huts had been planted with vegetables by the Germans before our arrival. It was against all orders to walk across this ground. A Belgian private soldier, acting as officer's servant in the camp, did so once and was banged into cells for his offense. No officer was put in cells for this, but that was not due to the lack of opportunity. I think the Germans did not want to cause trouble with their English officer prisoners, so refrained from rash acts of this nature. As we had been allowed to take only 1 box with us from Krefeld, some officers had purchased huge baskets in the canteen into which they had crammed great quantities of luggage. When these baskets were unpacked, the German authorities decided that they were too big to remain in the rooms, and so ordered that they should be removed from the camp to a store shed outside the wire fence. 3 officers availed themselves of this fact and hid themselves inside the baskets, arranging that strong English soldiers should carry them out, pretending that they were empty, and put them with the other large boxes in the shed. Thus, the officers would get outside the camp and eventually get away from the shed by night. All went well at first. The baskets were outside the gate and merrily moving off towards the shed when the Boek officer called upon the soldiers to halt and decided that as the soldiers were needed for other work, the baskets were not to be put in the storeroom till after 5 o'clock. Down went the baskets onto the ground and were then massed near the German sentry on gate duty. As it was only 2 o'clock and fearfully hot, the wretched inhabitants of the baskets had a very poor time of it, waiting till 5. One of the 3 did not keep still, and we could see the wickerwork straining from his movements. Awful squeakings and scratchings came from this basket, and although we tried to drown the noise by talking and shouting near the gate, the German sentry must have heard something and became suspicious, as he stood by them and looked carefully at each in turn. At last, they were taken to the store. What really caused their recapture, I don't know, but it appeared to be due to one of them showing himself at the window of the storeroom some 3 hours later. They had to be careful to arrange it so that one of the baskets could be cut open from the inside, and the others could then be opened with the keys that the occupant of this basket had on him. At about 8 o'clock, the German officer arrived, followed by a guard, went straight to the storeroom, and captured all three, who by this time had been out of their baskets for hours. We next saw them marched off to cells, where they were to do 5 months in solitary confinement. We had not been 36 hours in this camp before 3 officers did get away. Crashing along a ditch, they cut the wire and got through the hole which was in the fence opposite the nearest clump of undergrowth to the camp. How the Germans did not hear them crashing into these bushes I cannot conceive, as I myself heard them 70 or 80 yards away. These 3 were away about 10 days before being caught. Not very long after their exit, the German sentry noticed the hole in the wire, and so that chance was spoilt for anyone else. The clump of bushes, which had been so useful to the 3 escapers, was cut down by order of the commandant, and after that 100 yards of open clearing surrounded the wire fence, making a good field of fire for the sentries. Owing to the sandy nature of the soil, which had all the dirt-causing propensities of coal dust and none of the advantages of clean sand, we had to be constantly washing our feet if they were to be kept clean at all. Many prisoners, realizing what a lot of laundry work wearing socks in this dusty place meant, discarded their use altogether and simply wore football shorts and shoes, with an old shirt as top wear. Our rooms were perpetually in a filthy state. As soon as they were brushed, in came more of this sandy dust. A wind made life unbearable. These conditions are those of summer. Winter will mean a different tale. The open ditches, dry on account of the drought when I left, are hardly there as ornaments, but in all probability are filled to overflowing with the surface water from the camp when the rainy months come along. At the end of the camp was a space wired off from the rest of the ground for the use of the soldier servants. There was a wooden hut similar to those occupied by the officers, which did duty for the housing of the men. In this wooden hut, about 200 soldiers of all kinds and descriptions were packed Russians, French, Belgians, and English, and not a few half-German, half-Russian Jews. These latter men were allowed great freedom by the Germans. There was no fear of them escaping, so they walked in and out of the camp whenever they wished to do so, as far as we could see. They were hardly trusted by the rest of the prisoners, who had good reason to know what useful sources of information these persons are to the German camp authorities. I went to these quarters of our soldiers several times, although officers were not supposed to do so. But if no coat was worn, it was impossible for a German sentry to tell who was an officer or a private, so we used to adopt that plan if we wished to get into the enclosure. The crowded state of that soldier's hut was beyond belief. The beds were arranged as closely as possible, and then another layer fixed onto the tops of the ground floor ones. For the first 3 weeks of our life in this camp, we had to live mainly on the rations provided by the German authorities, since many of us had not been able to bring much in the way of tinned food along with us when we left Krefeld. The parcels from England were also delayed in their arrival, as the organization arranged for Krefeld had to be altered for Schwarmstedt. The food provided by the Germans at a daily cost to each officer of 1 mark 50 pfennig comprised the following: breakfast, coffee of the war variety, probably made with acorns; dinner, soup, always containing lumps of mangelwurzel, cabbage, black peas, and occasional pieces of potato. Twice or 3 times a week, tiny shreds of real meat could be discovered in the soup. There was often a liberal ration of grit in this soup, but no extra charge was made on account of that. The evening meal, soup of the sago or meal variety, generally exceedingly thin. In addition to these daily rations, we were each allowed to purchase 2 pounds of war bread per week at 60 pfennigs. This war bread was exceedingly nasty and doughy. If pressed with the finger, the indentation remained, as it does in other putty-like substances. Its color was a dark gray-brown, and its smell and taste were sour. I understood that it was mainly made of potato. It is amusing to hear the talk about the English war bread in this country to anyone who has experienced the same commodity in Germany. The German war bread most certainly has violent effects on the interior economies of those who eat it for the first time, without becoming gradually trained to stand the strain of such an ordeal by eating the different grades of bread which have been given to the fatherland during the last 2 years. Personally, I cannot justly complain, as I was one of the few who did not suffer from eating it. It was a great day when the first consignment of redirected parcels arrived. By standing in a queue for 2 hours, the parcel could be obtained from the German censors. One of the first prisoners to draw his parcel came back with it under his arm and a disgusted expression on his face. Nobody dared ask what he had got in his parcel. He looked too savage for the risk to be taken. However, it soon got about that he had got a dozen tennis balls. It was not surprising that he had looked like murder when one realized that no tennis was possible in this camp, and that food was what he most wanted. Fortunately, our trials in this latter respect soon ended, as the parcels began to come in as regularly as they did at Krefeld. In addition, the Krefeld commandant's promise that the food boxes would be sent on was fulfilled, and once more we had plenty of provisions. The soldiers also received their parcels now, and from what some of them said, they generally do wherever they are, thanks to the untiring energy of those who see to this for them in England. One day, we caught a specimen of the beasts which attacked us at night and took it to the German officer pinned on a board. He made excuses and blamed the wooden huts, saying how impossible it was to deal with vermin. However, our room was to be fumigated. We were ordered to clear everything out of our room, and then the Germans arrived with a blow flame with which to run over the bedsteads and clear out the cracks in the walls. Another German splashed creosote onto the floor and places too high up to be reached by the blow flame. We realized that this was all eyewash, as the gaps between the partition walls separating the rooms were in some cases wide enough to allow the passage of one's hand. Therefore, the many-footed beasts of prey lurking in such places would easily avoid the strafing by going a few inches next door via these cracks. Of course, the other rooms were not fumigated at the same time, so their preserves must have been entered by the game driven out of ours. We all wrote home for Keatings, but the letters never fetched up. The censoring of our letters was done at a headquarters censor's office at Osnabrück after our removal from Krefeld. This meant endless delay and often non-arrival of incoming letters, and practically a complete suspension of the outgoing mail. The reason for this latter fact is not difficult to explain. Of course, the prisoners described the new camp in these letters, and as the place was bad from every point of view, the contents of these epistles were not liked by the censors at Osnabrück. Consequently, the letters were either burnt or kept. Of course, the non-arrival of letters in England would do more to cause inquiries to be made at this end than anything else, but the Germans don't see things in that light. This camp, Schwarmstedt, was known as Number 2, but why a number should be assigned and no name given to it, only a Boche could say. Possibly it was because the Germans did not want it visited by any interfering, inquisitive neutral country representative, since it was such a bad camp. I was pleased to hear that it was visited shortly after, and a full report made. I believe some of the grievances were attended to. When we were at Krefeld, some of us had taken up fencing as a form of exercise and amusement. The sabres and épées were sent out from England, but the Germans were very careful to take charge of them on their arrival and used to let us have them at specific times, locking them up carefully at 6 o'clock every evening. This care was continued for over a year, and then, I suppose realizing at last that as weapons with which to attack the camp guards, they were absolutely useless, and that bed legs would be much more likely weapons if anyone wished to do such an absurd thing, they suddenly ignored the old fencing weapon, and we were able each to have his own. When we moved from Krefeld, I took mine with me, tied quite openly onto a kit bag. I hung it up in my room without thinking anything about it, until one day we were told that we were to be visited by a Boche general and that everything had to be extremely tidy and in its correct place. As the authorities here were much more fussy persons than those at Crefeld, and the arriving general was rumored a particularly aggressive England hater, I thought that I had better hide my saber, which I did almost entirely, only about 3 inches of it showing. Naturally, I was a trifle worried about this compromising thing, as I had never realized before that it might get me into trouble in this new camp. Whenever there was a search, I had to hide it. In fact, I got to dislike that saber. I never got rid of it finally because I got rid of myself instead and left it behind as a legacy to my room companions. I hope they haven't claimed it and taken over its troublesome propensities. At one end of the camp were 3 small huts known as machine gun houses, constructed originally so as to command the 3 streets of the enclosure. In 2 of these, the senior British officers lived, 9 in a room. The other one was the orderly room. In addition to these 3 houses, there were several machine gun towers dotted at intervals outside, but close up to the main wire fence of the camp. These also must have been designed originally as points from which turbulent prisoners could be overawed. After a week or so of English occupation of this camp, one of them was cunningly used to give cover to an escaping party. The exit from the camp was successful, but the actors in this drama were caught and brought back after several days away. The offending tower was promptly pulled down by the Germans and an extra sentry posted in its place. Near the soldiers' quarters was the building assigned to cells. I never saw the inside of them, but they were extremely small and hot in the summer. Officers in cells were marched out to the bath twice a week, and we could see them quite close and sometimes even speak with them while this was going on. They looked very white after a fortnight in these places, but that was due probably to the lack of sunlight. Each cell had a barred window about 8 feet from the ground, and occasionally we could see the faces of the occupants staring through the bars. Another wooden hut did service as a hospital. This building was the best in the camp, being painted white on the inside and having quite a clean appearance. There were not many officer prisoners sick in this hospital when I left. 3 or 4 bed cases was the total on the average day. Owing to the great heat, the rough grass and bog myrtle became extremely dry, and when a fire did break out, it burnt merrily for a long time in the surrounding country. On several occasions, the flames swept down on the camp, and the German guards, not on duty, were turned out to prevent their too close approach to the wooden buildings. Once a fire was only stopped 10 yards short of the nearest hut. The smoke was very thick and drove across the camp, obliterating it. Needless to say, some of us were watching the sentries very closely during this, but nobody got an opportunity of attacking the barbed wire perimeter by which we were enclosed. Rumor had it that a German village a few miles away had been wiped out by one of these fires. The German civilians, of course, blamed the prisoners, saying that they had caused these fires when smoking on parole walks. The commandant then ordered no smoking except on roads while we were out walking. The German commandant of this camp full well realized what an extremely unpleasant place it was and how unsuited for the accommodation of officers or for private soldiers for that matter. Evidently ordered to make the best of a bad job and told to try and smooth over the bad particulars of the camp by the skillful giving of small privileges, he attempted to get the prisoners interested in the building of a theater and the making of playing fields outside the camp. A strong section of the prisoners fortunately hung together and declared themselves solidly against taking advantage of these privileges until such time as the really important questions, which had already been the subject of numerous complaints by the prisoners, should be attended to, and action for the general welfare of the camp population taken by the German authorities. This camp was a miserable one if judged only from the details of existence there, but fortunately, as so often happens, there was a brighter side to it. The uncomfortable and trying conditions made for unity and cooperation among the prisoners themselves. The humorous side of life seemed to come to the fore more easily than at the comparatively comfortable camp of Crefeld. Cliques and factions existing during the previous 2 years at Crefeld were inclined to disappear, and a more general feeling of a common cause in the face of an unpleasant period steadily grew, closing the gaps in the ranks of the prisoners and tending to bring together people who would hardly bear to see each other under previous conditions. It is surprising what a difference the effect of a long term of imprisonment has on various people. To anyone gifted with the smallest powers of observation, the constant changes and rapid transformation of ideas and standpoints in the small world of prison necessarily came with interest. It is a strange fact, but nevertheless true, that some prisoners, forgetting that a prison existence is only temporary and entirely unnatural, seem to think that things matter in such a place and that the happenings and views of the outside world do not directly concern them. A long spell of such an existence changes a man more in character than the same period spent in the ordinary course of life. Some are tempered in the fires of such a test, while there are others.
This concludes today's reading of 13 Days, The Chronicle of an Escape from a German Prison, by John Caunter. Join us also the day after tomorrow for the subsequent part. Subscribe to Major Intonio's channel. Thank you for listening, and so long.